Hi everyone, welcome to MEG Motors. Today we're going to be looking at this chainsaw. It's a Poulan P3314, which is a 33cc 14-inch chainsaw, 14-inch bar. Don't know too much about this one. I got this off of a Facebook Marketplace ad. It doesn't run, and the chain is off of the bar, which is interesting. Not sure why that is. And the chain actually looks like it's too long for the bar, so this may be the wrong chain. So before we go too far, we're trying to figure out why it doesn't run. I'm gonna pull the cover off of this side right here and see what's going on with the clutch and make sure everything's okay in there before I spend a lot of time trying to make it run. So I'm gonna reset the camera and we'll tear into that and see what's going on and go from there. All right, so to start taking this off, I'm going to use, this is a tool that typically comes with a chainsaw. It's just one that I have laying around the shop, but it has the right size socket for these nuts. I'm going to take both of these off. This cover doesn't want to come off. All right, so yeah, you can see in here that the chain is off the clutch. Ooh. And in fact, the clutch is stuck. Oh, well, had the blade brake on. That makes sense. All right, so there we go. So yeah, the chain had jumped off the sprocket back here, which is why it appeared to be too long. So we're gonna go ahead and put this back on and see if we can adjust the chain and get it to set at about the right length. And so the adjustment mechanism for the chain is inside the cover right here. So we have to put the cover back on to adjust it. And so to make this work, this protrusion right here on the adjuster has to fit into this hole right here on the bar. There we go. Just about like that. So the main reason that the chains typically jump off of the blade, or jump off the bar, is because the oiling system doesn't work. If the oiling system doesn't work, the chain will overheat and stretch, and then it will jump off of the bar. The other common reason for them to come off is just being out of adjustment. This one is way out of adjustment. So we got to at least adjust it, and then we'll have to determine later on after we get it running whether or not the oiling system is working like it should. So to adjust this chain, there's a small screw right here, and we use this same tool. And if we tighten the screw, we can see it'll pull the blade out away from the saw and tighten the blade up, tighten the chain up. And so we want to get it to where it's snug but not overly tight. That feels pretty good. Well, it just kind of hung up right there. All right, and then we're going to snug these nuts back down. All right, so that'll get us to where we can do a start test. So we know we need three things to make this engine run. We need spark, and it has to spark at the right time. We need compression, and we need fuel in approximately the right ratio. And I've pulled this through. It feels like it's got plenty of compression. So we're going to take the air filter off, the air cleaner cover off, and we're going to spray some carburetor cleaner in there, and we're going to pull it through a few times and see if it'll attempt to start. If it'll at least attempt to start, we know that we have our spark and spark at the right time, and we have enough compression, and we'll start looking at the fuel system, which is the most common issue with these. I'm going to grab a wrench and be right back. We'll finish taking this air filter cover off. All right, I'm going to reset the camera, and we'll spray some carb cleaner in there and see if we can get it to start. Okay, so we have the switch on. We're going to open the throttle, open the choke, and spray some carburetor cleaner in there. And then we're going to pull it through a few times to see if it'll at least attempt to start. So nothing so far. All right, well, it should have popped off by now, so we're gonna have to do a little more checking. We're gonna pull the spark plug out and see if we have a spark. Okay, so I'm using a spark tester here, which is really nothing but a metal contraption here that has a gap right here, and has a clip that goes to ground, and it plugs into the spark plug wire, and it just basically replaces the spark plug. And so if the ignition system is working, we should see a spark across this gap right here. So I'm going to pull it through a few times. A lot of times this doesn't come out on camera. I can see it here, but when I look at the film after the fact, it doesn't show up on the camera. So I'm just going to pull it through, and hopefully we can see it on camera if it sparks. Yeah, we have a really good strong spark. So we know we have a spark. It feels like we have enough compression. I'm going to try one more spray test, spray a little more spray in there. The spark plug came out dry. So here it is. The color looks good, but it's dry, so we may not have sprayed enough carb cleaner in there. So we're going to spray a little bit more in there, and we'll try it one more time, and then see if we need to look further. All right, so here we go with our second start test. I'm going to spray a little more fuel in there. And we're going to see what happens. All right, so still no start, which means that we could have a spark at the wrong time, or I don't know, maybe we don't have enough compression. It feels like we have enough compression, but maybe we don't. So yeah, let's do a little more checking and see what we can find. All right, well, an interesting thing happened while we were off camera. I was playing around with it a little bit more, trying to see if I could figure out why it wouldn't start. And I pulled it through a few more times, and not only did it start, it stayed running. So right now, here's what we're looking at. Yeah, it actually runs. So the only thing that seems to be wrong was the chain was off of the blade. So I looked it over a little bit. It's an interesting turn of events, right? I do feel that the fuel lines are hard. One of them at least is very, very hard. And the primer bulb looks old and yellow. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and service this one, put some fuel lines in a bulb and open the carburetor and make sure everything's okay. My plan is to sell this to somebody, and I wanna make sure that they get a good chainsaw when they get one. I can already see, I'm going to show you this right here. You can see hopefully on the workbench, there's a streak right underneath it, which is oil. And so then the chain even has oil on it now. So the oiling system appears to be working. So it runs and the chain oiling system is working as it should. So again, not sure why this one's ever taken out of service. The chain came off for some reason on somebody. It was way out of adjustment, and maybe that was all that was wrong, and they didn't want to fool with putting it back on. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to pull the carburetor on this one and take a look at the fuel system and make sure that it's all okay. And then, yeah, hopefully we can pass this on to somebody and it'll make them a good chainsaw. I'll reset the camera and we'll go through that, and then we'll give it another test run when we're done. Okay, so to get the carburetor off of this one, we're going to take these two nuts off. Takes an 8mm socket. And we're going to take this bolt off. It's a Torx head 25 T25. That'll get the air filter off and out of the way. Choke just comes out like that. And then we'll have to see, there we go, the throttle linkage disconnects, and the carb, we got a couple fuel lines on here. The main fuel line, the feed line, actually feels fine. It's just the line to the primer that feels like it's gotten hard and stiff. Need a screwdriver to help get these lines off. They're kind of falling apart. There we go. And then the carburetor should come right off. I will tell you on this particular carburetor, it's an interesting carburetor because it's like almost like a two-barrel, if you know what a two-barrel carburetor is on a car. It's got a primary chamber down here, There's the main throttle right here. And then at the upper range, it actually opens a second butterfly up top. But you have to be very careful about this plastic piece. I've had many of these break on me. In fact, this one looks like it is broken. It's been broken and glued back together maybe. This plastic piece is not available, and so if you break this piece, you have to replace the carburetor. It's the only way I know to get another one of those pieces. And so be careful with that plastic piece. Yeah, here's some of the fuel lines. This one just came off the primer as soon as I touched it. Now they're not the worst that I've felt for sure, but this one is split right here. Oh, that's where I took it off, I guess. Yeah, definitely needs some work. All right, so we're going to go ahead and replace those. Let me get reset, get some fuel line out here, and we'll replace those and put a new primer bulb on it. Okay, so here's our carburetor. This one is a Zama. Zam and Walbro being the two most popular brands. Like I said, this one is like a 2-barrel carburetor. Has the primary butterfly right here, and then at upper openings it opens this upper butterfly up here. And so first thing we're going to do is we're going to take this secondary butterfly off because it's in the way for some other stuff we need to look at. Let's set that off to the side. All right, so now we're left with basically our standard diaphragm style carburetor. So this has two parts. It has a fuel pump on one side, this side that pulls fuel out of the tank, and then there'll be a passage through the carburetor that supplies fuel over here to the metering chamber side, which is where the fuel is stored for the engine to run. And so we're going to open up the fuel pump first. It's pretty rare that we find problems in here, and given that this one ran, I'm not expecting anything. But wow, look at that. Just when you think everything's going to be fine, look at all that dirt right there. All of that dirt right there just came out of this, the fuel pump side of this carburetor. That's pretty bad. And so on the fuel pump side, what we're looking for is this diaphragm. It has a chamber right here. Make sure that's the right chamber. This diaphragm right here is the fuel pump diaphragm, and this is pulsed back and forth with pulses from the engine crankcase. And then these two flaps right here are one-way valves. And so these one-way valves sit on top of these holes on the fuel pump side, and they act as one-way valves. They'll let fuel come out but not go back in. And oh my. Yeah, so this, and then the fuel, basically the fuel pump will pump fuel up out of this pipe, up into this chamber and around, and it'll come out over here and be presented over here to this part of the carburetor right here, which is, normally it's a screen that's a pre-filter, but this one is still there. The screen's still there, but this one is just full of dirt. So I'm suspecting that either the fuel filter has fallen off inside the tank, or at one point it had fallen off. It may be on there now, but at some point this was run with unfiltered fuel, and it's really gotten the inside of the carburetor dirty. It doesn't look like there's any damage in here, so I think we're still okay. We're just going to clean this up before we put it back together, and then I think we'll be all right. So hopefully that screen did its job, and this side over here is going to be clean, but we'll open that up and see. All right, so here's our metering chamber side. The fuel comes from the fuel pump side up under this needle right here, which is controlled by this lever. And it actually looks clean on this side. So, and given that it ran, I wouldn't expect to see it too bad, but you never know. And then we have over here, we have our metering diaphragm. Oh, well, so this diaphragm right here is important. It actually controls the flow of fuel into and out of the metering chamber. So as it sits here on top of the metering chamber, and as fuel, the engine pulls fuel out of this chamber, it'll pull this diaphragm down, and the diaphragm will hit this lever and lift the needle off of its seat, which will allow fuel from the fuel pump side to flow into this chamber. And as it fills, the diaphragm will raise off of this lever, and the needle will reseat to block fuel from flowing in under pressure. And so this metering diaphragm should be very, very soft and flexible. And this one, again, not the worst I've seen by any means, but it's definitely harder than it should be. And so we will we'll put a new diaphragm in this one for sure. I'm surprised it ran as good as it did. Usually when they get this hard, they don't run very well. if they run at all. But this one actually was running okay, it seemed like. So yeah, we'll put a new diaphragm on there and put this back together. So let me gather some parts and do a little cleanup work, and we'll be right back. Okay, so I pulled us a new diaphragm. As you can see, this one is very, very soft and flexible, whereas this one, I don't know if you can hear that or not, but it kind of crackles when you move it. It's very stiff and rigid. I'm going to go ahead and take the needle out of this one as well. So I'm going to take this screw loose, and I'm going to hold my thumb over this because all of this is spring loaded. And it's a very small spring, so if it goes flying, good chance you'll never find it. All right, so here's our needle. Hopefully you can see that. Doesn't look too bad. I've seen worse. But we're going to clean that up a little bit. A little carburetor cleaner. I want to be careful you don't do this too much. The carburetor cleaner can react with some of the rubber parts in here and actually ruin them, make them swell. And so I don't like to leave the carburetor cleaner on them for too long. All right, so we're going to put all that back together. Our needle goes back in. Our spring goes back in its spot. And then our lever, I'm going to set it down on the spring, and then I'll work it back under the needle for. And then once everything's in place, you can look from the side to make sure that the spring is under the lever where it's supposed to be. And then we'll put the retainer screw back in. Oops, there we go. All right, one more thing we need to check. All right, so this is a special gauge made by Zama, and it's in the shape of a Z. We're gonna look and see what number is on this carburetor. It looks like a C1M. And so you look on the gauge, all these letter and number combinations are here, and we find C1M, and that'll tell us what edge we're supposed to use. And so to use this gauge, we're just going to place it across the gasket surface, and what you should see is that the lever just barely touches the gauge. And this one is actually a little bit away from it. So it's a little bit too low. So we are going to just put a screwdriver under it, and we're going to bend it up just a little bit. And then we'll recheck. There we go. Still just a little bit low. Yeah, I know that's very hard to see on the camera, but you get the idea. And so the height of this lever is important for this engine to run properly. And so yeah, so we're in good shape there. So we're going to put our, the gasket goes on first. It'll go that way, and then the metering diaphragm goes on next. And then this cover. And the retainer screws. And so I clean this side up, I clean that screen out, that's what that should look like. And then we're going to put this cover back on, the fuel pump. Put it screw back in. All right, that all looks good. And then we're going to put our secondary butterfly back on with the 2 screws that hold it on. All right. So that finishes our carb overhaul. So let's go work on some fuel lines and a primer bulb. All right, so let's get started putting some fuel lines on this one. So we got our primer bulb here. It actually feels okay, but it's turned color, and typically when they get to looking like this, they're not going to last much longer. So here's the replacement. They're just held in with a couple of snap clips on the side. And so I'm going to reach in with a screwdriver, release that snap clip, and there's our old primer. And so we'll dispose of that one and snap in our new one. I already drained the fuel out of this one, and looking in the tank, I can see that the return line, so this big line is the return line. So when we pump the primer, we'll pull fuel into the primer and push it back into the tank. And so we need to replace this line, but inside it's got a small plastic piece that's designed to help this line, to keep this line from being pulled out of the tank. So we can't just pull this line out of the tank like we'd like to. And so what we're going to do is we're going to reach down and we're going to cut it off, and we're going to try to pull it into the tank by reaching in through here with a screwdriver. Sometimes we can pull it in this way, and sometimes we have to push it from the outside. It's coming in. There we go. All right, let me see if I can get that out of the tank so you can see what that looks like. All right, doesn't want to come out. It's kind of wedged itself down in there. There we go. There it is. Yeah, so this little plastic piece here, its whole mission in life is to make the end of the hose bigger so that it won't pull back out through the tank. And so we just need to put that on the new one to let it do the same thing for the new fuel line. All right, and so to pull that fuel line in, we're going to use this tool. And so this tool is one that you can buy. It has a hook on one end and just a pull ring on the other. And so we can feed it in through the hole where the fuel line comes out, and then we feed it out we feed it out the opening where the fuel cap goes. Then we can take our new fuel line, which is right here. We're going to cut a taper on the end of it. Makes it easier to pull it through. And then we are going to, let me go get a punch. We're going to use a punch like this to poke a hole in the end of that line. And then once we have a hole in it, we should be able to feed it onto the tool. Although sometimes this can be the hardest part. I don't know why. There we go. We got it on there. We're going to use a little lubricant. Anything you have will work. Soap. Or a little grease or oil. And then we're going to pull that line back up through that hole. Just like that. I don't want to pull too much out because I'm just going to cut it off so that I can put this stopper on it. In fact, All right, so I'm going to cut this line off right here. I'm going to put this little plastic piece that we've taken out of the old fuel line right in here. And then once we have that in place, we're going to pull that line back up. We're going to pull that line up until it stops. And then we know that that plastic piece has gotten up against the top of the tank. And so that's how long we need that line to be. And so now we need to replace this line. And this is the fuel pickup line. It's a much smaller line. And it has a weighted fuel pickup on the end. The problem is that this tool doesn't fit in that hole where this line comes through. And so when you run into that, you have to kind of make your own tool. And so I've made my own tool out of this. This is a piece of safety wire that I've just bent a hook on the end. And this tool will go through that hole. Although even that tool is a little bit tight. Same thing though, we'll take a piece of fuel line. This is a much smaller fuel line. And we'll cut a taper on the end of it. Just like that. We'll poke a hole in it. And we'll feed it onto our homemade tool. We'll lube it up a little bit, and we'll see if we can pull this one up out of the hole. There we go. Same thing. And then we'll just put the weighted fuel pickup on the new line. And I think we're going to need a little lubricant on this one because the fitting on this pickup is pretty large for such a small line. So like I said, looking inside the carburetor, it looks like at some point this engine was run without this filter in place. Although it's in place, it was in place when we took it apart, but with this in place, it shouldn't have got that much dirt inside the carburetor. So at some point, I believe this was not in place. All right, and then we're just going to feed that back in, and we're going to pull out enough line so that that weighted fuel pickup can go to the far edge of the tank. All right, that's good. Now this line, we know this line is the line back to the fuel tank, and we talked about the primer. The primer has two output fittings on it, one long one and one short one. And the short one is always the intake side and the long one's the exhaust side. So when you push the bulb, it pulls fuel in the short one and it goes out the long one. And so this line, which goes back to the tank, but just to the very top of the tank, is going to be on the exhaust side of the primer. So we're going to clip off our taper, and then we're going to put this line on the primer. And then we're going to need one more line from the primer that's going to go up to the carburetor. So we're going to put this line on the short side. And so when the system is all together, we're going to pull, use the primer to pull vacuum on this side, which is going to suck fuel. It's going to suck air out of the metering chamber, which is going to pull the diaphragm down. It's going to unseat the needle, which is going to let that same vacuum travel through the passage over to the fuel pump side, and this side here is going to be connected to the fuel tank to pull fuel out. So the small line is going to go on here, and the other line going to the primer is going to go over here. And so we can start putting all this back together and cut our lines to length. So this line is going to go right over here. So we're going to cut this one off just a little bit. We're going to put that one on this fitting right here. And then this line is going to go over here to our other fitting on the carburetor. I'll cut that off, put that on as well. All right, so this line I think is still a little bit long. I'm going to cut this one off just a little bit more. There we go. All right, and so now for a test, we should be able to put the fuel back in the tank. Unfortunately, we just lost our gasket here. I'm gonna go see if I can find an O-ring that'll fit this, and I'll be right back. All right, so I found an O-ring that fits. I'm gonna put that back on. And then we're gonna pump our primer bulb, and hopefully we'll see fuel come up this small line, go in, come out, and fill up the bulb and go back to the tank. So let's see what happens. I saw fuel coming in this line just now, and there it is coming back out, and see our primer bulb was full of fuel. All right, so that's a carb overhaul, new fuel lines, and a new primer bulb. We're gonna put this all back together, and we're gonna see if it'll start up and run. I mean, it ran before, so I don't have any doubts that it's gonna start and run again, but let me put it all back together, and then we'll give it a run test and make sure everything's good. Okay, so this is all back together. We're gonna give it a start and see how it runs. Switch on, set the throttle. So if you pull the choke out on this one and then push it back in, it sets the throttle to part open, which can help it start sometimes. We're gonna pump the primer. Yeah, let's see what happens. That sounds pretty good. I'm going to set the throttle again. So yeah, that sounds pretty good. I mean, I didn't really expect any different after all it was running before we started working on it. So it's not surprising that it sounds okay. So yeah, I think this one's fixed. I'm not sure there's ever really anything wrong with it other than the chain came off the bar. We put that back on, seems to be working fine. The oiling system is working. It's spraying oil on the bench like it should. It starts easy, runs good, so I think we'll call this one fixed. Everything that we did, pretty much the fuel lines, the carburetor work, and the primer bulb were all just maintenance to make sure that this one's going to be ready to run for not just now, but for the next foreseeable future anyway. It should last for a good long while. So yeah, I think this one's ready to go to work for somebody. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Check my playlist. There's other videos out there about small engine repair. And stay tuned. We'll see you on the next one.